On a high cliff above the endless sea, where the land met the horizon in a quiet embrace, there stood a lighthouse. Its tall white tower rose proudly against the evening sky, weathered by years of sea winds and salt, yet steadfast and strong. From the village below, it looked like a guardian watching over the restless waters, and for those at sea, it was a comforting star fixed upon the shore. Within this tower lived an old keeper, a gentleman whose hair had turned silver with time, and whose hands carried the marks of long, steady work. His name was Elias, though most simply called him the keeper. He had been tending the lighthouse for so many years that even the gulls seemed to know him, circling lazily overhead before drifting down to rest on the rocks near his door. Elias lived simply. His cottage, small and cozy, was built beside the base of the tower, its chimney puffing soft curls of smoke on chilly evenings. Inside there was always the scent of tea, wood, and sea air. The shelves were lined with books he had read many times, journals where he wrote down his thoughts, and small treasures he had collected from the shore, smooth shells, polished stones, and bits of driftwood shaped like curious little sculptures. Each piece reminded him that the sea gave as much as it took, and in its own way it always spoke to those who listened. Every evening, just before the sun melted into the horizon, Elias would rise from his chair, put on his thick coat, and begin his slow climb up the winding stone staircase of the tower. Step by step he moved at an unhurried pace, listening to the echo of his boots and the occasional creak of the old beams. The climb was long, but Elias never minded. It gave him time to think, to feel the weight of the day slipping away, and to welcome the quiet that came with the night. At the very top of the lighthouse, behind a heavy brass door, rested the great lantern. It was a beautiful machine, polished with care, its glass windows gleaming as if holding pieces of the sky itself. Elias always paused here, his hand resting on the cool metal, as though greeting an old friend. For in truth the lantern was his companion, the steady flame he had watched over for so many years. It was not just light, it was hope. As the last streaks of sunlight faded, Elias struck a match and lit the wick, coaxing the flame to life. Slowly the lantern grew brighter, its golden glow swelling until it filled the room with warmth. The great lens around it began to turn with a low hum, casting long beams of light far across the darkening sea. From the windows, Elias could see those beams sweep gracefully across the water, stretching farther and farther until they touched the edge of the world. Down below, the waves crashed softly against the cliffs, their rhythm like a heartbeat in the stillness. The sound comforted Elias, reminding him that no matter how vast the sea was, it moved with a steady, eternal rhythm. He leaned on the railing of the balcony, breathing in the cool night air, the salt sharp on his lips. The stars began to appear, one by one, glittering above like lanterns in the sky. Sometimes Elias imagined the sea and the sky were speaking to each other. The sea sang in whispers, its waves murmuring stories of journeys and storms, while the sky answered with its quiet twinkle, steady and calm. And between them stood the lighthouse, his lighthouse, holding its place as the bridge between two worlds. When the light was set and shining strong, Elias descended once more to his cottage. He moved slowly, without hurry, for the night was long and the sea unchanging. Inside, he poured himself a cup of tea, the steam rising like a little ghost in the lamplight. He sat by the window, where he could still see the glow of the tower above him. To the villagers, the light was a guardian, but to Elias it was a companion. They slept soundly because they knew that up on the cliff, the lighthouse keeper never failed. That trust warmed Elias's heart, a deeper comfort than words could offer. He sat by the window, hands folded around his cup of tea. The steam had cooled now, but he did not mind. The warmth of the night came not from the drink, but from the sea's song, the lantern's glow, and the stars above. He let his eyes wander upward, tracing constellations he had known since boyhood. They were old friends, shining down on him with steady patience. The North Star, bright and constant, reminded him of sailors steering their way home. Orion's belt stretched proudly across the heavens as if keeping watch beside him, and the Milky Way spilled across the sky like a river of silver dust. The gulls had gone quiet now, tucked into their nests on the rocks. Even the wind seemed hushed, moving only enough to stir the grass and ruffle Elias's hair. He leaned back in his chair and sighed contentedly, the sound blending with the sea's rhythm. For a moment he closed his eyes, listening more deeply. He imagined the waves speaking directly to him. "Rest easy, keeper. We are calm tonight. We carry ships safely across our back, and we thank you for your light. Together we guard the night." He smiled at the thought. Whether the sea truly spoke or whether it was simply his old imagination, he could not say, but the feeling it gave him was enough. He felt less alone, less like a single man in a lonely tower, and more like part of something vast and unending. Elias rose and stepped outside his cottage. The cool night wrapped around him like a cloak. He walked slowly along the edge of the cliff, careful with each step, until he reached a flat rock where he often sat. From there, the view was endless. The horizon stretched on, the sea dark but alive with subtle light where the moon touched it. For a good, the lighthouse beam swept across, glowing like a guardian's eye, then circled back again. He listened to the low hum of the great lens turning above. He listened to the splash of the waves against the rocks below. And in those sounds he found harmony. To Elias, the sea and the lighthouse were not separate. They were partners. The light watched from above while the sea sang from below, and between them lay peace. As the night deepened, Elias lingered on that rock, breathing slowly, letting the quiet seep into his bones. He thought of the sailors far away, the villagers asleep, the creatures in the depths, the stars overhead. All of them were part of this night, all bound together by the simple, steady rhythm of waves and light. And in that thought, Elias felt contentment. His work was humble, his life simple, but it mattered. It mattered to the sailors who sailed safely by. It mattered to the families who slept without fear. It mattered to the sea itself, which seemed to sing more sweetly when the light was burning bright. So he sat a while longer, listening, watching, and quietly smiling as the night went on. The hours of the night moved gently onward, each one slipping quietly into the next like waves folding over the shore. The lantern above turned with its steady hum, casting light across the sea in slow, graceful sweeps. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, almost like breathing, bright, then shadow, bright, then shadow, until even time itself seemed to soften and blur. Elias returned from the cliffs to his cottage, his steps unhurried, as though the night had asked him to move slowly and savor its stillness. Inside, the lamp on his table flickered warm. He set a fresh log in the fireplace and sat once more by the window, where he could keep watch on the glowing tower. The fire crackled softly, the sea whispered beyond, and together they wrapped the little room in peace. It was in these quiet hours, when the world was asleep, that Elias often let his mind drift into dreams even before his eyes closed. The sea had a way of carrying him there, its song like a lullaby that blurred the line between waking and dreaming. The sound became shapes in his mind, rolling hills of water glimmering under moonlight, silver paths stretching across the horizon, and creatures rising from the depths like memories surfacing from the heart. He saw schools of fish with scales like starlight, gliding silently beneath the waves. He saw dolphins leaping gracefully, their bodies arcing against the glow of the moon. And further still, he imagined the great whales, slow and ancient, singing to one another in voices that rumbled like thunder beneath the sea. In his half-dreaming state, Elias felt as though he were there with them, drifting on the water without a ship, carried along by the current like a leaf. The waves held him gently, rocking him with care. Above, the stars shimmered as though watching over his journey, and the lighthouse beam reached across the sky, not just a guide for sailors, but a lantern for him as well. The night deepened further. Shadows grew softer, stars brighter, and the hush of the village below turned into complete silence. Elias breathed slowly, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the sea. His thoughts floated further into dream, weaving stories of their own. He imagined the lighthouse itself as a living guardian. Its tall, white frame was no longer just stone and steel, but a gentle giant standing watch. The lantern at its crown was like a watchful eye sweeping across the waters, not in duty alone, but in love. It watched over sailors, over villagers, over Elias himself. And perhaps Elias thought it had been watching long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. The idea filled him with a soft comfort. He was not alone in his vigil. The lighthouse stood beside him as steady as the stars, as eternal as the sea. Together they kept the night safe. Together they offered peace. Elias opened his eyes again and gazed at the waves. Moonlight glittered upon their crests, each one sparkling for just a moment before vanishing into the dark. He imagined each shimmer was a dream being carried across the sea, dreams from sailors far from home, dreams from children asleep in the village, dreams from travelers in distant lands. The ocean gathered them gently, carried them carefully, and perhaps delivered them to the shore of morning. The thought made him smile. Dreams, he decided, were like the tides. They came and went, always returning, always flowing. Just as the sea never ceased its rhythm, so too did dreams never stop finding their way to those who needed them. The hours stretched on, but Elias did not feel weary. The peace of the night filled him, steady and unbroken. He set down his empty cup of tea and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. The fire had burned low, glowing softly like an embered star, and the shadows it cast danced faintly on the walls. He remembered his younger nights at sea, when sleep was rare and uncertain, broken by storms or the endless labor of ropes and sails. How different it was now, this calm, this softness, this sense of being held by the world instead of fighting against. Age, he thought, had brought him a gift. The ability to rest, to find beauty not in the horizon he once chased, but in the stillness he now kept. The sea outside seemed to agree. Its song grew slower, deeper, as though it too was drifting toward slumber. The waves curled gently onto the rocks, sighed, and retreated again. The sound was so steady, so tender, that Elias could almost believe the ocean was breathing alongside him. He let his mind wander once more. This time he imagined that the sea was a great blanket, stretching endlessly, tucking the world beneath it as it fell asleep. The stars were lanterns hung carefully above, glowing softly to guide all dreamers. And the lighthouse, his lighthouse, was like the final candle, keeping the night safe until dawn returned. Elias closed his eyes again and breathed deeply. In that moment he felt himself become part of the dream. Not just a man in a cottage, not just a keeper of a light, but a note in the great lullaby of the sea. His heart beat slowly, like a drum keeping time with the waves, and his thoughts dissolved into the vast, gentle silence. Time passed unnoticed. Perhaps it was minutes, perhaps hours. Elias did not know, and he did not care. He was content to drift in this space between waking and dreaming, where the sea whispered, the stars twinkled, and the lighthouse glowed with eternal patience. At last his head tilted to the side, and his breath grew deeper. Though his eyes were closed, his heart remained awake enough to know that the world was safe. The light was burning. The sea was calm. The night was holding him. And so Aeneas allowed himself to drift further, deeper into the dream the sea had woven for him. The night moved on, quiet and slow, as though time itself was treading softly so as not to disturb the sea. The great lantern in the lighthouse continued its patient sweep, its golden beams carving wide arcs across the dark water. Out on the horizon, the light was still seen, by sailors steering their way safely, by fishermen returning to shore, by those who trusted that the world was watched over even while they slept. Elias sat in his chair by the window, wrapped in the peace of the hours. His eyes traced the lantern's glow above the cliffs. It was strong, unwavering, and steady, just as it had been every night for as long as he had tended it. He let out a long, slow breath, as though his own body was moving in rhythm with the pulse of the light. Beyond the cliffs, the sea sang softly. Each wave rolled gently toward the shore, curved in silver beneath the moon, then folded back into the vastness again. The sound filled the air, a lullaby for the earth itself. The old keeper listened with half-closed eyes, his thoughts drifting like ships carried by the tide. Sometimes he imagined those ships as lanterns too, small flickering lights moving across the dark sea, each one guided by the larger light he tended. Perhaps, he thought, his own life was a lantern as well, burning quietly in the darkness, offering warmth and guidance without asking anything in return. The thought comforted him. His years had been well spent, his nights well given. The fire in the cottage had burned down to glowing embers, casting only the faintest orange glow on the walls. Shadows moved slowly with each crackle, as though even the flames were ready for rest. Elias shifted in his chair, pulling a blanket across his knees. The warmth was gentle, and he felt the heaviness of sleep beginning to settle over him. Outside, the night had grown deep and still. The gulls were silent in their nests, the village lights extinguished completely. Only the sea moved, whispering in its endless voice. Above, the stars gleamed brighter than ever, scattered like diamonds across a blanket of velvet. The moon hung low now, its reflection shimmering across the waves like a path of silver light leading to infinity. Elias closed his eyes and let himself drift. He thought of his younger days, of voyages made and horizons chased, of storms survived and skies filled with brilliant sunrise. He thought of the day he first lit the lantern of this lighthouse, his hands younger then, his heart full of determination. And he thought of all the nights since, nights of storms, nights of calm, nights of silence, nights of song. The sea had changed 1,000 times, yet the lighthouse had always remained, and so had he. Now, though, he felt a new peace settling over him, a deep and gentle rest unlike any before. His duty was fulfilled. The lantern would keep burning long into the night, its flame steady, its light reaching far. The sea would keep singing, the stars keep shining, and the world would go on in its quiet rhythm. Elias leaned back fully in his chair, his breathing slow and even. His blanket wrapped him like a cocoon, the warmth seeping into his bones. The sound of the waves carried him further, deeper, until his thoughts blurred into dreams. He imagined himself walking across the moonlit shore, each step soft on the sand, the lighthouse shining behind him like a star. The sea called to him, not with urgency, but with kindness, inviting him to rest. And so he did. His head tilted, his eyes closed completely, and the keeper drifted at last into sleep. His breath grew softer, steadier, until it blended perfectly with the rhythm of the sea outside. The lantern above kept turning, sweeping across the waves as faithfully as ever, as though keeping watch not only over sailors and villagers, but over Elias himself. The night passed on. The sea continued its song. The stars stood guard, and the moon laid its silver path across the water. All was safe. All was calm. When morning finally came, the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and rose. The waves gleamed under the newborn day, and the gulls began to stir, calling gently into the cool air. The lighthouse still stood tall and proud, its lantern finally dimming as the sun took over its work. Inside the cottage, Elias still sat in his chair, wrapped in his blanket, his face serene and calm. He had fallen into a rest so deep that it seemed he had become part of the very night he loved so dearly. His lantern had not gone out. It had simply joined the eternal rhythm of sea and sky, a light now woven into the fabric of the world itself. The villagers, looking up at the cliffs, saw the lighthouse as steady as ever, its glow fading with the rising sun. They smiled with trust, knowing the night had been watched over once again. The sailors who passed spoke of the beam that had guided them through the darkness, grateful for the unseen keeper who had lit their way. And though they did not know it, the keeper had taken his final watch, leaving behind not sorrow but peace, for the lighthouse would always stand. The sea would always sing, and in their partnership the spirit of Elias would always remain, calm, gentle, and eternal, like the light that never failed. And so the story of the keeper's night came to its close, not with an ending, but with a soft continuation. Much had become part of the world's endless cycle, his rest part of the ocean's song, and to all who looked upon the lighthouse, they would always see his gift, a light that burned quietly, faithfully, forever. And so, dear dreamer, as the waves still sing and the lighthouse still shines, may you too drift into gentle rest. The night is safe, the light is steady, and the world is holding you softly until the morning comes.